Thanks a lot. Um, I think by agreement, I'm going to kick things off a little bit, and I'm going to kick off in a way that's less about digital than it is about mediation. And to one of the key things that Marcell and I do in the course we teach in digitally mediated ministries is try to make sure we understand that this is a theological issue. And the Bible actually begins with the concept of something being mediated. The world was created through the Word of God, right? The Word was the medium through which the world was created. And in the same way, we refer to Jesus Christ as a mediator, the mediator between us and God, the one who brings to us the reality of God in human form and incarnation. So the concept of things being mediated is deeply part of our biblical heritage and understanding of just the way the world works. And this continues in church history, just as a reminder. The theology of the sacraments. The sacraments and worship are back about mediums, about media, the ways in which God is made known to us. The scripture is the same. The Word of God has the same kind of theological characteristic. It is a media, a book, through which God's presence becomes present in the church. Now, with that kind of theological introduction, you know that we've got then a lot to chew on, whether we're talking about worship or music or our theology of the incarnation or evangelism or mission. We're constantly thinking and talking about what are the different media, the different medium through which God makes God's self-present to people. And where that begins to accelerate historically, and if we had a time for a whole semester course, then I would spend an entire class on this, is when we begin to move beyond sort of traditional media, which would be oral and visual and to some extent written but not printed. These are the media, the liturgy, the worship, the oral tradition, the books for those who can read, that are deeply embedded in the Christian tradition. Where things begin to change and to speed up is, of course, with first the invention of the printing press. So that the Bible as a form of media becomes widely available to people and ever more widely available as people become literate. So that people's encounter with God is not merely going to be through a weekly or daily mass or worship service. It's going to be through reading a book. And that this happens in the Reformation. It happens with the rise of a literate class of urban people in Europe. And we have not only the Bible, but we have devotional books and other forms of media that now become involved in the Christian message and in the Christian life. Then there's going to be another kind of speed up in this when we go beyond the ability to print books to cheaper and cheaper printing. And as a result of this, we don't just have Bibles and devotional books for the people who can afford them, but you begin to have broadsides, newspapers. By the 19th century, you have millions and millions of cheap, inexpensive evangelistic tracts that are being produced, or the Bible Society, which will be producing very inexpensive Bible portions. And of course, translation begins to play a role with the Bible. We move beyond the Latin and the English and German vernacular Bibles to Bibles in all of the world's languages. And that happens really very quickly, within 200 years. So that we have the development of print media and the wide distribution of print media as a critical feature of our life. And by the way, something then that spurs a lot of theological reflection. Is the Word of God the words of God? Is it a Bible if it's got notes in it? Is it a Bible if it's only a portion of a Bible? Believe it or not, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Bible Society spent a lot of time thinking about whether you should ever produce just a Gospel of John as opposed to a whole Bible, right? And even up until today, the Bible Societies produce no Bibles with notes, right? They don't, because that would not be the Bible. So that already begins reflection. Well, then, of course, what begins to happen is, to spur us on, is we have the invention of the first digital media. And I'm going to let you think about it and try to guess in your head before I tell you what the first digital media is. It's the telegraph, dots and dashes, right? It's not an analog media. The telephone comes after the telegraph. The telephone's an analog media. But the telegraph does not immediately change the Christian world except for missionaries, where it's like as with international business, it's huge. But shortly after the telegraph, there comes the telephone, and then we have the invention of radio. And with the invention of radio, you can honestly say that you now have the first mass electronic media. One person can broadcast and many people can listen. And that establishes itself super quickly in the late 18th and beginning of the 19th century, and it's accompanied by another kind of mass media called the phonograph, where you can have one person sing a song or preach a sermon, and you can make many, many, many copies and distribute them out for people. And believe it or not, Christians and Christian churches jumped right onto this. We were early in using radio. We were early in using phonographs as a media, even if the average Christian didn't experience this directly. Television, of course, comes along, and we now have the prospect, as we have with radio, of evangelism, of broadcast worship services, of broadcast Christian music. I'm a native of Dallas. I can remember growing up in the 60s and 70s with Sky, KSKY, the voice of the gospel in Dallas, Texas. I believe it was owned by the Hunt family, but not my Hunt family. So we had radio preachers and all of that, and pretty soon we have televangelists. And all of a sudden, these media are incredibly important. Well, it's not a very big shift then when these now traditional television, radio, analog media begin to shift over and become digitized and take their place on this new thing called the internet in the early 1990s. And, for those of us that are old enough, that really is pretty new. I had one of the first 80 email addresses in Singapore, and that was 1992. It was a little bit earlier in the US, but not much earlier with CompuServe. But now, all of a sudden, through something called email, you could reach out and give a lot of people a message and exchange messages worldwide. And then the World Wide Web comes along with this thing called a browser. And now, and the browsers then develop more and more and more, and we get to the point now where we can quickly and digitally interact with each other, broadcast messages, have interactive worship services and other experiences. And as that has happened, the church has had to wrestle with, what do these new media mean for the way in which we experience our life in community and the way in which we experience and share the gospel? And so a lot of what Marcell and I are doing, and I'm going to end my little introduction here, is on one hand trying to keep up with sort of the bleeding edge of these things, and on the other hand making sure that we understand that theological reflection on mediated ministry isn't just a product of the last 15 years. We've been thinking of radio as a mediated ministry and television as a mediated ministry for a long time. And by the way, for us United Methodists, with some suspicion. We have been very late adapters of both radio and television because we United Methodists were very suspicious of it. It belonged to a different kind of church than we were. And even now we find ourselves catching up. So I'm going to finish. That's so you get an idea that we've got a lot to think about here, and I'm sure Marcell has some things to follow up with.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to spend some time with y'all. And the point that Robert makes and that we make to students at the beginning of every section of this course is that we're not going to teach people how to use Facebook Live or Instagram Live or whatever. I mean, there's a significant paradigm shift. I'm going to talk about a couple of these paradigm shifts as we move forward. between the way that we used to think about learning and the way that learning happens today, right? I remember when I was a young undergrad studying music, and in the 90s, and the internet was very new. So every time I found something interesting, a musicological article or something about worship or a jazz primer, I would print it, because I didn't know if that website would be up in a month, right? So my default was to revert to this analog version of this digital thing so that I could, we don't do that anymore, right? We don't. Do you ever think that the website that you rely on Tuesday will not be there on Wednesday unless there's a crash or something? In
We're
a
doing
sense,
the opposite.
What?
We're doing the opposite.
We're doing the opposite. Yeah. So now, that life in which the digital component is either, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, of what that digital has become. But it's, instead of a fringe benefit, it is part and parcel of the way we live, especially in this context, right? That's an uneven claim across the world. But even when you look at, cell phone statistics in developing countries, or it's still staggering. So in a sense, we've crossed the threshold, and this is unrelated to the pandemic. There's a lot that has been done in the past couple of years. I would say in the past 10 years of scholarship in the humanities, not only in theology, to think about what this increased mediation does to the way we think about ourselves, to the way we think about what it means to live in community, right? So there's one scholar, for example, Thomas Sordas, who talks about increased and more intense conditions of neighborliness. So that's that idea that, if you were here and someone was in Singapore before, that implied in one kind of interaction, but that interaction has intensified if you wanted to, right? Now, where in the past, it might have involved ICQ messages over 24 hours, and this is pre-Messenger, pre-Microsoft Messenger, right? Nowadays, you have a multimodal, almost immersive portal to experience and to share things with someone who physically might be halfway across the world. And so we hit this point before COVID where this is being talked about a lot, and unevenly adopted, I might say, across the denominational spectrum. And that suspicion that Robert mentioned is a very important part of that landscape, because in a sense, it's almost a question of negotiation of identity, where you're going to say, we don't do televangelism because, and then you give all these reasons, but mainly you're saying because televangelism is identified with this other feature of the landscape, another place, right, on that Christian denominational landscape. Well, then COVID hits, and it does a couple of things. While most of the questions that it has forced us to ask are not new questions, as Robert so appropriately outlined for us, it has definitely catalyzed the need to respond to these questions, because they become urgent, right? They might have been important before. Think of Johari's window, right? They might have been important before. Now they are important and they're urgent. You have to figure it out, because next week your congregants won't be at church, and you have to figure out what you're going to do or not do. So it's catalyzed our engagement with these questions, forcing us to deal with certain issues, and it's leveled the playing field, right? So suddenly, your online offering is just as available as the online offering from, the mega church who has been doing virtual services for 20 years now, has all the gear and all the people and all the money, and you're stuck with your phone and perhaps a microphone and trying to figure out how you're going to preach, and how in the world are you going to record any music, right? So because I'm in church music, I interact a lot with church musicians, and they kept telling me my job has fundamentally changed. I am now a video and audio editor. I'm not a conductor anymore, right? Yeah. So it's leveled that playing field. And the reason why Robert and I think this class is hugely important is because coming out of the pandemic, as we kind of slowly and stumbly, we stumble our way out of the pandemic, if you will, then what was a fringe benefit before becomes a crucial component of the way you plan and perform ministry, right? So in the past, I'll give you an example from my own ministry. As a church musician, I was kind of used to expecting some form of angry email on a Monday, right? Depending on what you do on Sunday, you'll get that email rant. It's like, how could you allow this to happen, or whatever. Yeah. But the primary feedback that I looked for happened in two ways. One was during the worship service. If people were responding, laughing at my jokes, standing, kind of, there's a back and forth that happens, a mutuality that is performed in-person worship that we are extremely comfortable with because we've been doing it for forever and ever, right? Mm-hmm. And that angry email was a smaller component of the way I assessed the efficacy and the validity of what we were doing on Sunday. Another way to say that is you might have, your pastor may or may not have had an Instagram account that tweeted out devotional nuggets throughout the week before COVID. But after COVID, that almost became all you had. It was all you had. So I was only left with the emails. I didn't have that direct feedback anymore. And then you had to scramble to learn how to listen and learn how to design and learn how to plan. And coming out of COVID, we are convinced that equipping our students to be able to pay attention to and think theologically through the digital components of their ministries will be very important. It'll be crucial for the life and the health of the church.
Yeah. If I can just jump in.
Absolutely.
Two things that come to mind. One is, of course, that to be available through this digital mediation, one does have to learn a set of new skills. And one of those skills, which I'm trying to do right now, is to look at a camera and act like it's a human being. And engage with the camera because that's what's on the other side is a human being. It doesn't look like a human being, but it is. And the second thing is that the church overall really needs a ministry of tech support. My own home church, and I think every church, all of a sudden is going online, relatively easy to get onto Facebook Live, but all of those people out there that are trying to get involved in it, who've never done Facebook or anything, need help. They, you can't just say, okay, we're going to now have a digitally mediated ministry for people who are under the age of 40. You've got to reach to everybody. So you have critical pastoral skills that need to now be developed, and you also have this broader ministry of reeling people back in and getting them back involved now that you're digitally mediated. But there's a huge promise, and maybe Marcell can say more about this as well, which is that all of a sudden, because you are out there as much as anybody's out there, you can suddenly reach people who you'd lost track of. So many, many churches, probably the majority of churches, found more people attending their online worship than were attending face-to-face. And who were those people? Shut-ins. The people who moved 2 years ago to be in a nursing home close to their children and never got involved in another local church. Or maybe who just moved away and never got involved in a local church, but still have a sense of belonging with a Sunday school class or a local church back home. All of a sudden, those people can be re-engaged. And this is one of the, we talk about a fringe benefit. It's more than a fringe benefit. One of Marcell and I's students pointed out to us, who's disabled, pointed out to us that he's far closer to the people who are in his virtual community because he can touch them easily any time of the day than he is to people in a physical church community, just because it's a huge, even with all the disabilities access and everything, it's a huge effort for him to make himself physically present in a church. But to make himself virtually present is extremely easy. And so we do have this wonderful opportunity, but it means that we're learning some new skills. we're having to think about the theology of this communion and stuff, and of course we're having to think of the church as a place that provides technical support, to, for want of a better word, that helps people work their way through the technology and get on board with what's necessary to be part of a virtual community.
Yeah. And I think, Robert, just to tag on to what you said, I mentioned that example of printing jazz primers because I didn't know if they were online. Right nowadays, we tell our students we're not going to teach you how to use Facebook Live because there's a video on YouTube that will do that much better than we ever could.
Exactly.
Right. So, in a sense, part of that preparation is available, and it becomes a matter of systematizing what is available so that it makes sense for those who are looking for that kind of education. But when we started, this course arose from a meeting, and I remember Dean Hill, Robert and I were probably ranting about how important it was to talk about digital ministry, and Dean Hill was like, well, excellent, design the class then.
Yeah.
And it's been a unique opportunity, but also a challenge because it's a curriculum that is not standardized. Right. Yep. I mean, different places do offer parts of these things in different ways, but it wasn't systematized in a way that made sense for the kind of work we do and the kind of students that we have. Systematizing that curriculum forced us to deal with theology and beyond theology in a different way. Right. So Robert mentioned, the disability theology. We had to bring that in. The theology of inclusion, theology of hospitality. We had to help students navigate their sacramental theology because they suddenly were forced with questions that they wouldn't have to deal with in another setting, right? Because if you're in a denominational setting that says this is how we do it, if you don't go through this kind of crisis, that's great. You can just do the way you've been, do your thing. Once that crisis hits, you get all sorts of questions that are being answered unevenly across the denominational spectrum and unevenly across the hierarchy of one denomination. So your bishop might be saying one thing, but your parishioners are asking for another.
Yeah.
And you have to mediate that conversation. So it definitely has been an interdisciplinary exercise with pop culture studies, media studies, economics, a ton of technology, journalism, things that we wouldn't otherwise we wouldn't interact with on this kind of systematic basis that we are now.
Sure. Well, and let's talk about ethics. We have a story of Jesus and the money changers in the temple. Well, as soon as you're online with Facebook Live, the money changers are running the temple. I mean, that's all the ethical issues around the fact that you're inviting your congregation into a massive data gathering effort designed to sell products. And that may be invisible to them, but it's part of the reality. It doesn't, there's ways, part of what we have to talk about in the course then is, yes, we all jumped into Facebook Live, but maybe do we need to use another streaming service that isn't so commercially oriented, right? Do we have some ethical issues then we have to sort out, in which, and what makes them genuine ethical issues is that you really are balancing accessibility for people next to the questions about data gathering and commercial products. And there aren't straightforward answers to that for each congregation, right? A huge congregation that's very, very well set up and has plenty of money may be able to afford to stream their own stuff through a website that they control. But that's not going to be true for the average congregation. So all of these issues, and by the way, I think they're fun issues. I've got to tell you that our students are brilliant in engaging them. But they are genuine issues. I'll mention some others. With learning, we find ourselves, once we're digital, we find ourselves competing. Okay, so when the pastor held a Bible study on Sunday morning, the only competition was another pastor down the street holding a Bible study. But if a pastor's leading a virtual Bible study online, then all of a sudden the pastor's competing with YouTube, is competing with the Bible Project. And we're placed in a bigger reality. And the reality is this: the largest source of theological education, and the most people are getting theologically educated, is YouTube. The smaller of the websites offering very high quality Bible study online, the smaller of them have millions of subscribers. The bigger ones have tens of millions. And so we're finding ourselves asking, what's our purpose here? Right? It's as if I want to produce a little educational video, and I'm up against Warner Brothers and Netflix and all their resources. So what do I have that's unique? What do I have that's distinctive? These are questions. By the way, we do have things that are unique and distinctive. Okay? But we now find ourselves wrestling with those contexts and those issues. And by the way, and Marcell's kind of at the leading edge of this in music, the problem of the constantly changing technology. The COVID drove technological development in this realm, specifically in the church. In other words, the technology available to the church to develop specifically religious types of communities has moved very quickly because there was a demand. And so every congregation is now having to ask a serious question of, well, do I invest in this, or do I wait till the next thing? Right? Do I do HD, 4K, 8K? Do I hire a service on a monthly fee to come televise, to produce my worship service for streaming online, or do I try to do it in-house? How much money do I put into equipment that'll be out of date in 12 months? Those are questions that we try to engage our students with thinking about, and very often come down to individual congregations, right? What's best for my congregation is a conversation that a pastor now needs to lead with their church. And that's part of what we're doing, is how do you now lead that in conversation intelligently? And show leadership, by the way. Pastors need to be leaders in this, not followers of the, it's way too easy to let the geek that's 22 years old all of a sudden become the effective congregational leader with no theological training. That's not going to work either. Yeah.
I think we're past the 30-minute mark,
Yeah.
and Robert and I are going to talk a little bit more, but we would love to end with a Q&A. So if you have questions, as Lee mentioned in the beginning, feel free to shoot them his way, and we'll get to as many as we can before the hour is out. Because there's just too much to talk about in an hour, right? We do this in a semester, and we still feel like there are so many topics that we could explore in more depth with our students as we a lot of the time we're not giving them answers at all, right? We might right. Give them trends or statistics, but it is a deep examination of oneself and of one's congregational culture, ethos, demographics, vision, strategy, in order to push past this kind of boundary of fascination with technology, right? Which is a pitfall that I think those of us that grew up in a world, in an ecclesiological world of competition, and saw what happened with the seeker-sensitive movement, with the emergent movement, suddenly there was this like pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So if my music sounds enough like U2, then people will come to my church. Right. So you hear things like that, or if my worship is cutting edge, or if my teaching pastor, does this or that, if my worship leader has a long beard and wears skinny jeans, these things will magically transform your congregation. We're past that. We're past that. But I do think that one of the things that this examination of digital ministry has forced us to do is consider what are the temptations that are dangled in front of us right now, right? So that promise, like, hey, if you buy this product, if you master this technology, then your church will be in a position to do this or that. When in fact, it's like in music. If I get a composition student that comes to the MSM, we have a composition track. and if they tell me, hey, I want to learn how to compose like whoever it is they want to learn how to compose like, I tell them from the beginning, my job is not to make you reproduce someone else's musical voice. My job is to guide you to a place where you are expressing yourself. And that is incredibly difficult to do as a person and incredibly difficult to do as a congregation. The information revolution at large and the COVID pandemic specifically have pushed us to look, I'm tempted to not say look at ourselves in the mirror. I would rather say look at ourselves on a screen, because that's what we do, right?
Right.
And say, what are we really doing here? How can we serve our community? How can we provide the pastoral leadership? How can we enable community connections and community conversations, little plug there for the name of this program, in a way that is serving the people that we are serving? And that might include some fancy new technology. It also might include a phone tree. And to be honest, you know, our students who are placed in congregations have told us more than once, we tried this, we tried that. You know what really worked? The phone tree.
Yeah.
So we're saying, do that. But your 20-year-old will probably not want to pick up the phone, right? So that brings another level of negotiation into this self-examination, where you're saying, you're putting together a new mosaic. And that mosaic may include a phone tree, but it may also include, you know, a weekly Zoom hangout thing with no set liturgy, in which people pray silently and share memes. You know, things that we don't necessarily think about all the time, but they could become a part of the digital expression of your congregation.
Yeah.
And Robert, I'll pass it on to you in a second, but just even deciding what that digital component is going to be, how much energy is going to go into that, and how does that fit into your overall ministry plan, is part of that self-examination process.
Yeah. I was just going to add to this. One of the real problems with temptation here is how to have genuine worship, genuine study, genuine fellowship, genuine meditation, and not slip into becoming infotainment, right? And that's what having a sort of set of rigid rules and technology available tends to do. If I follow these rules and I bring to bear this technology, then I will successfully imitate someone who appears to be successful. But I may not be doing what is me anymore, right? I may not be doing what my church is anymore. So a term that we use from missiology, my own field, is appropriate technology. What's the appropriate technology for us to be ourselves in our ministry in the world? And that's going to vary. It's going to vary. One of the other challenges here that Marcell alluded to is the generational challenge. Well recognized the difference between digital natives and non-digital natives. Some of us are old enough to be non-digital natives, but hung around in that world for so long that we're pretty native. But every congregation faces the problem of what's the big platform that can reach everybody, and then what are the small things we need to do to reach the people who might fall off the edge if we don't. And again, this is not a new question, right? Every church from the time I was a child, that was a very long time ago, had little speakers or something in the back for people who were hard of hearing so they could hear the sermon. We knew that we were going to lose people that began to lose their hearing. So we made an accommodation for them. We tried to keep them in, even though it was a very small number of people for the average congregation. And so now digitally we end up doing the same thing, but we have to think about it in an intentional way. If I want to reach 12 and 13-year-olds, I may need to be distributing my messages on TikTok, okay? But I probably won't reach 18-year-olds who now regard that as passé and childish, okay? If I'm going to reach older people, maybe Facebook. And then the big question that every congregation asks is, how many resources do I have to do all this stuff? I've now sat in on 3 different national webinar kinds of things on digitally mediated ministry, the same question always comes up: what do I need to be doing with social media to reach people? And the answer is always the same. If you have the resources, it's just like in your Sunday school. If you have the resources and enough people, you can have grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you can have 25 adult classes. But if you're in a county seat church, then maybe you're only going to have kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, etc. Well, it's the same thing with all these digitally mediated ministries. The one ubiquitous thing across all age groups is Facebook. So if you have to choose one, you go there. Then you begin to make decisions about who are the target people that we can most easily reach with different things. And again, it's all about asking these questions. And oftentimes I will tell you, and I've seen this twice now with specific churches I've worked with on this, when they begin to ask the question about how to do this right, this digitally mediated ministry right, they discover a lot of things about themselves and a lot of resources that they actually had available to themselves that expand their ministry under any circumstances. The process of seriously asking, who are we, who do we minister to, how do we minister for a digital age, then makes us ask, well, what do we have available to us? What can we do? So I think Marcell's right. It's probably time to do some Q&A. You've heard our enthusiasm. We're anxious to answer your questions if you have them.
Yeah, we have a lot of great ones. Thank you so much, and please keep them coming. We will answer as many as we can, although selfishly I want to start with one of mine. Something I've been curious about is, we're going from a system in which, whether you're an executive senior pastor or a music minister or a Bible study leader, you're genuinely only available and public facing once a week, maybe twice, to frankly being plugged in and open and receiving input from people all the time. How does one in any of these ministerial roles really set digital boundaries about their availability, about their energy, their bandwidth?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because for pastors and church workers, the boundary issue has always been there. As soon as there was a telephone, there was the problem of when am I going to answer it and when am I not going to answer it. And I think that discipline just becomes a more and more difficult thing as people sort of expect instant 24-hour gratification. I'm not sure, Marcell, do you have any wisdom for?
I think there's a couple of things. One is just acknowledging that this is a question that we share as a culture right now, right? If let's say you were an accountant that worked in the office before COVID, and now you work from home, you felt that pressure,
Yep. Right?
So I think recognizing that this is a question that in a sense we share is important, because it makes it less lonely.
Yeah.
We can share the misery, if you will. Then the second thing is how we narrate that predicament to ourselves, right? So if on one side of the coin, you say, when do I make myself available to others? And on the other, you may recognize the value of asynchronous cadences. What do I mean by asynchronous cadences? If I'm in a live conversation with you, Lee, and you ask me a question, I only have a limited time to think about that answer. I'm going to improvise my way through that answer, or I'm going to say, I don't know, or I will answer it on point, right? I'll do what I can with what I've got. One of the beautiful aspects of asynchronicity is that I can give thoughtful, pondered responses to certain things, and I can dictate the cadence of the interaction in a particular way, right? So from my own perspective, one hard thing to learn for me in ministry, while I was trying to assert myself as valid leadership, was to realize that answering emails on demand was a waste of my time, and was also a terrible way to listen to what my parishioners were really asking.
Yeah.
So I learned over time, and that these things take time, right? I learned over time that, I would do this at 4 p.m. when I've had time to think and do other important things, and then get to that and establish a rhythm for yourself and communicate to your parishioners what and how. So you might not be able to reach me on Snapchat, but you will be able to reach me on Facebook Messenger. You won't be able to reach me on Instagram chat, but you will be able to reach me on WhatsApp or things like that, right? So clear communication, and in a sense, and I think intentional boundaries, that's just common sense, right? We've been telling our MDivs that for years. It's like, you have to, no one's going to control your time for you. You're going to have to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Another one we got in kind of a couple of different forms is some specific questions about parts of worship. So the two that were singled out were, what does online communion look like? And then how has virtual ministry changed music ministry, especially for traditional services?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be a bold thing indeed if either Marcell or I had an answer to the online communion question. This has raised a lot of questions, and I think what's maybe important about that particular question is to take it seriously, because the serious theological dimension of this is that in the midst of the communion's celebration, when we say, and therefore with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, we do this. In other words, we actually say that it's a virtual community that we're part of. So it seems strange theologically to say that we're creating a virtual community in communion, but it's not legitimate if part of that virtual community happens to be online instead of in heaven. Right? I mean, the Holy Spirit, if the Holy Spirit can bind us to the angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, then surely the Holy Spirit can bind us to people who are 100 miles away sitting in front of their computer. So that's why it's a serious question and not to be dismissed lightly. This other side of that anthropologically is that as humans, we are embodied creatures who are meant to touch each other and are created for that. And there's pretty good evidence that actually we are a touch deficit society in the United States for a variety of reasons. And the removal of touch through COVID has had a profoundly negative effect. I mean, some of us, like me, are more waspish than others, but still, how do we balance these two things is I think a serious question. Now, Marcell will have something to say about music. I sing in a choir, and I can tell you it's strange to record music in advance for a church service that's going to happen on Sunday.
Yeah, I'll endorse Robert's answer on the communion thing. As a lot of the work I do in theology has to do with worship, liturgy, and ritual studies on the anthropology side. So there's a part of me that is more interested in listening and seeing what churches are doing and how they're answering that. One resource that might be useful, Dr. Mark Stamm, our worship professor here at Perkins, has written on the issue of communion, and recognizing that there are many component parts to that, I think is important. It's not only the liturgical sacramental efficacy of performing the liturgy of the Eucharist, but also the human component, the power component, which is another. I keep saying that in that sense, digitally mediated ministry at large, and COVID in particular, has messed up two P's of being a church. The first P is the performance. So you can't preach for 45 minutes on Zoom and hope your parishioners will stick with it for a long time. They're not going to, right? Yep. They might in a live setting because it's awkward to leave in the middle of a service, right? But if it's online, there's no accountability, right? If your sermon's boring and it's 40 minutes, you'll have no listeners. So changing the performance. And then the second P is power, because of that social setting in the past and the fact that you were the pastor, you had power to keep them in their seats while you rambled on for 40 minutes. Now you can't do that anymore, right? Because of the kind of horizontal playing field and the fact that competition has changed in the digital marketplace, there is a very real sense of loss of power and leadership that we've been hearing about in our classes, and the frustration of pastors saying, we don't know what to do, right? We don't know what to do. So power and performance. Now, let me circle back to that music thing, Lee. There is no right answer here.
Yeah.
Right. The only thing that I can say that it would be wrong to buckle down and power through, because if you try to buckle down and power through, you're not listening. You're not listening to what's happening. You're not listening to the congregation. You're not listening to the worship needs of the congregation, and you're not figuring out what you should be doing because you're more worried with what you've lost. Now, don't get me wrong. That grief, I truly and deeply believe that the grief of what we lost is an integral part of pastoral ministry now. But we have to be grieving what we can't do the way we did it, because it's a significant loss, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we do have to figure out ways to move forward in terms of everything, but specifically in terms of the music. I'm going to end, Lee, by saying that from the music business side, we've been hearing about the changes in the music market for 25 years, right? I mean, remember Napster, mm-hmm. right? And musicians in the world at large have had to deal with the job description of what they did, and the social media component, and the technology and recording component, and the live component, and the album release component, because the digital world kind of changed the industry. Churches have remained, for better or for worse, one of the few places in which people still engage in live music making in modern life. But churches have also been one of the places that have buckled down and powered through, saying, this is what we do and we're not going to change it. And church musicians have done that as well. And now many of them are having a hard time because they didn't go through the technological and media 2.0 that they should have gone through in order to serve not only their congregations, but also in terms of excellence for their careers. And I'm not saying that, you should go contemporary, traditional, or whatever. I'm not saying that at all, right? If you look at the classical music market, the choral and organ market nowadays, it relies on technology, just as the pop rock people do, and the Americana and the folk rock people do. And so it is jarring to realize that we weren't on top of our game. Yeah. There will also never be a better opportunity for you to become on top of your game, because it is in the interest of the institutions that you serve that you do so right now. That can assume many different expressions, anything from a virtual choir to live synchronous worship using particular software to silent worship. I've seen congregations going full Quaker. Yeah. Like we're going to sit in silence together instead of singing, because we can sit in silence together. And if we try to sing a choral anthem via Zoom, it becomes a chaotic mess. So we're going to sit in silence. So that performance of worship changes, and then parts of it will come back to normal, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's going to be essentially the same as it was before.
I'll just add one other quick thing, or two things maybe. One is the issue of quality comes up. We in the exposed world of a digital world, then that which is slipshod and lacks quality becomes very, very apparent quickly. And a great deal of worship, traditional, contemporary, everything, has been slipshod and lacked quality. And I think all of our pastors and churches are going to have to come back and realize that that's not going to work anymore. Your competition isn't the Baptist church down the road. It's the whole world. And expectations of quality have gone up. The other thing about this is that, and it's the one thing I get tired of hearing from my students, is, well, we can't do that. And the answer is that the technology is developing so rapidly that you often can. And so it does become part of the task of those who lead in worship or any kind of technical stuff, to at least have some idea of what's possible rather than saying this can't be done. Mm. And then to then take a serious question. Okay, it's possible. Do we have the energy, time, and expertise to do it? Maybe not, right? But I think for many in our congregation, especially the younger parts of our congregation, to say we can't do that is not an acceptable answer anymore,
Yeah.
because they know it can be done. They're seeing it done. Do you need 1,000 people to sing a sea shanty together? Well, don't say it can't be done. I just watched it on YouTube,
Yeah.
right?
That's
So
a great example.
yeah, that's
Look it
something.
up, y'all. If you have what COVID and sea shanties, big deal.
Big deal. Big deal. Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
Anyway, go ahead, Leah.
yeah, to that point, I mean, we've talked about grieving the things that have changed forever that we've lost, and we've also talked about, the possibilities of the future. But it seems to me, and several people have asked versions of this, that the question is kind of, how does one walk the middle? We had COVID, it's ending, and we have these new workarounds and these new skills and these new technologies, but we also have expectations of, going back to the old ways. And what is the way one seeks the answer to what is that happy medium, I guess?
Yeah. I'll tell you this from just our students now from 2 classes. Informally polling them as well as the students in my evangelism and world religions class on this, the one answer I get back most consistently is we're never going back to just the old way. There are too many advantages for outreach, for inclusion of people with disabilities, to the online component of ministry, to ever just go back. Because to go back would be to actually intentionally exclude people who have become part of the community. So then the walking the middle part is, well, how do we realize all the values of face-to-face worship and community, and at the same time do the appropriate things that allow us to expand and extend that community digitally, without letting that suck up all our time and energy, right? We put huge amounts of time and energy when it was absolutely necessary. Now what we've got to somehow do is continue without it draining us, without it becoming the new focus of who we are. And again, I think that's going to depend very much on individual congregations as they make an assessment. One of the things I would say from our perspective at Perkins is to make sure our students are aware of all the tools they have so that they can in fact choose the appropriate tools for what their congregation needs to be working with, so that they're not just limited to one thing that they heard of from one person, but that they can look at a big toolbox of digital stuff and go, here's what we can do to most effectively do our ministry, even as we're moving back to live and face-to-face.
I think, and this is maybe a little bit of a grand claim, but I'm reminded of the monastic movements of the 4th century, right, which involved various motivations, anything from a desire for intimacy with God to avoiding taxes. But there was, in a sense, in that period, in the whole movement, this question of how we should be spending our time and what does it mean to be Christian community. I'm reminded of the story of Martha and Mary in Luke, and Jesus's answer when he says, Martha, you're upset about many things, but few are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. Right? I think in ministry, as congregations, and this is not just for clergy at all, as congregations, we come to these crossroads where we have to answer for ourselves and for our churches. What is that? What are the few things that are needed, right? And there are certain disciplines and vocations that are built deep into the fabric of what it means to live a Christian life. The need for contemplation, for life together, for these very profound things. I don't think any of that has changed. The temptation of what we're going through is that we become haunted by the extremity of the demands that we're dealing with right now. Anything from we have to go all the way back to what we had before, to we have to go full cutting edge digital, like razor sharp production. Mm-hmm. Both of those things I think both of those temptations need to be addressed with the words of Jesus when he says, few things are needed, maybe even one. Mary has chosen that which is good, and it will not be taken away from her. So I go back to that dynamic of a deep examination. I did not expect this class to include the kind of flavor of spiritual formation that I think it has, in a sense, because students are being forced to deal with these questions. But in the process, they do come out, or at least we hope they come out, and with the better answers to these questions, right? And I think, Lee, that ties into all the things that you were saying about time management and what platforms should we choose, what should we don't, because in the end, and especially for clergy, then the question is, how do I lead? How do I pastor, right? It's more of the same, and it's comforting to think that these are deep questions now, just as they were, 5 centuries ago, and they will continue to be so. And answering them honestly and transparently, I think, continues to be part of the way we honor God in the process. So I didn't answer your question, but I did so with biblical support, so that's fine.
Right.
Well, we're pretty much at an hour. Thank you guys so much. If I can get one more question out of you, and I think this is very well asked, it is, if you could give one piece of advice to a congregation for all of this, basically, what would it be?
That's hard.
Yeah.
It is hard. I would say to any congregation, begin the process by looking deeply at who you are and what you see as your ministry and the community you're part of. And then answer every question about how you use your building, how you deploy your times and talents, who are your pastors, how you attract volunteers. And then finally, all the questions about how we're going to make use of this digital revolution and everything that it offers us. And let your use of it revolve around the fundamental answer to that question. How do we make the good news of Jesus Christ real in the community that we're a part of? Whether that's a geographically bounded community, or it may be a community that's digitally spread across the nation or the world. But if you can keep that question central, then you actually have a real basis for taking everything and answering it intelligently. And then the one thing to avoid is the opposite of that, which is saying, okay, but we've always done it this way. We don't live in a time where you can always do it this way, and we'll never live in that time again.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That's it right there.
Sorry, Marcell.
No, that's it. Nailed it on the head.
With that, we will leave you. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, Robert and Marcell, for doing this. Really appreciate it. We will be back with another community conversation this fall. You will hear about it. If you heard about this, you will hear about this next one. And it will be dealing with some really exciting developments with the Bridwell Library, and it will feature our head librarian, Anthony Elia. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.